Another day of bombing, another year of Russia's war on Ukraine.
With each shelling, we only become stronger. We adapt it. We survive every day.
Ukraine's resistance, its resilience, and its refuge. Now, the inside story, Russia-Ukraine, Year 2.
Hi, I'm Carolyn Pursuti, VOA Senior Washington Correspondent at VOA's Rooftop Studio. Marking 1 year of Russia's war on Ukraine is in itself remarkable. Most analysts and experts expected Moscow's military to march into Kyiv relatively quickly. Ukraine's tenacity is now being fortified with weapon systems from the United States and NATO. There are questions, though, about the depth of the political will to keep spending billions of dollars to supply Ukraine. But there is no doubt about the will of Ukrainians to fight and defeat the Russians. Ahead, you will see their resolve, how they are surviving day by day, and discover the ripple effects the war is having around the world. We'll start close to one of the war's front lines, the city of Kupiansk in northeastern Ukraine. Russian forces occupied it from the war's start until it was liberated in early September, but Russia wants it back and has bombed the key railroad town daily since its latest offensive began in late January. Jan Boshat shows us the struggle for those who left the town.
After months of enduring Russia's year-old war in Ukraine, a woman by the name of Nina says she has given up.
We simply didn't expect anything like this.
For the past weeks, the bombing has been too constant, too hard, too close.
Виталий, ты?
This person wants to be evacuated. Can you write down the details? She can't use her phone. I'm passing the phone.
Алло?
Good afternoon. Can I go on Monday?
1 week before this war entered its second year, Nina decided to leave the life she had built here since 1993, when she came from a small village on the Romanian border.
The bombings never stop. I'm still alive because a power plant was close to us, which protected us. But now, I don't know anymore. It's time to go.
The Russians have been bombing Kupiansk daily for the past month, sometimes all day long. Destruction is everywhere, and many here believe the city may be doomed to a fate like Bakhmut, where Russians and Ukrainians have been fighting street by street, house by house, for months. Kupiansk is a strategic city. It is an important railway hub connecting the entire northeast of Ukraine with Russia. But bombs are only part of the problem here.
The local citizens are on the edge of a humanitarian catastrophe, have lost their jobs, and have no means to live anymore.
Ivan Azonov oversees civil defense in Kupiansk. He says promises of help from the United Nations and other Western organizations have yet to arrive.
Things are becoming worse. We need the help from our Western partners to hold and don't let them to move further.
Local humanitarian aid organizations have tried to offer some relief to the Kupiansk's 16,000 residents. In this kitchen, 6,000 meals are served every day. For many, this is the only food they get.
The problem is not food. The problem is money. People have lost their jobs.
Without money, there's simply no easy way out. Many are forced to stay. Larissa Polyakova and her father, Ivan Zaika, have lived in a basement for 3 months.
There are no jobs. I'm living on my dad's pension.
Larissa once worked in a small clothing factory, but like most businesses around here, the factory closed. Her father is almost blind following a stroke and can barely sleep with the constant sound of artillery.
Ну, вообще плохо.
Состояние здоровья или же...
Нет здоровья.
И здоровье тоже. He keeps saying that to live like this, it's better to be dead.
Так жить, так лучше умереть.
Not far from there, a man ignores the sound of artillery and tries to catch a fish at this frozen river. Somehow, life goes on in Kupiansk. Jan Boechat for VOA News, Kupiansk, Ukraine.
U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen visited Kyiv earlier in the week, echoing American support for Ukraine for, quote, as long as it takes. Estimates to rebuild Ukraine run from $350 billion to $1 trillion. Amid the devastating attacks by Russia, Ukrainians are determined to see better days. From Kyiv, VOA Eastern Europe Bureau Chief Miroslava Gangadze gives us a glimpse of Ukraine's persistent resistance.
Russia's full-scale war has taken an enormous toll on Ukraine, its infrastructure, and on the Ukrainian people. The National Democratic Institute says 37% of Ukrainians who took part in a study said they had lost a friend or family member since the war began a year ago. Still, Ukrainians remain hopeful about the future, says Institute Director Martin Valetsky.
Against this background of terrible, difficulties, Ukrainians remain very optimistic. There is a strong level of support for the leadership, and there is hope that within international support, this war would be over soon.
Valetsky says Russia has used this information to try to divide Ukrainians and convince them the West is not committed to their country. But Valetsky says this strategy has backfired.
92% of Ukrainians would like to see Ukraine being a member of the European Union. 87% would like Ukraine to join NATO. And this is a very solid support which we've seen over the last year. It's amazing to see how pro-European, pro-NATO Ukrainians are. I've never seen anything like this in my history.
Ukrainian political analyst Mykola Davydyuk agrees.
Russian invasion make NATO and EU fantastically popular in Ukraine, and the people understood that our unique way is only into the West, and we are moving that direction very fastly.
Meanwhile, ordinary Ukrainians say they are strong and resilient after a year of war and sustained missile attacks by Russia.
On the 24th, everyone just came together and demonstrated that we really are one nation and that we don't want it.
With each shelling, we only become stronger. We adapt it. We survive every day. This makes us stronger, and we only show the enemy that we are not afraid of anything.
After 1 year of full-scale invasion of Ukraine and 9 years of war, this wall of remembrance honoring Ukrainian heroes who died defending their country is running out of space. A few days ago, U.S. President Joseph Biden came here to pay tribute to Ukrainian sacrifice. Russia is trying to wear down Ukrainians' resistance with prolonged war and regular missile attacks. But those techniques have not been effective. They make Ukrainians more resilient. As the war drags on and evidence of Russian war crimes in liberated territories becomes known, public opinion research shows Ukrainians are overwhelmingly committed to victory and the liberation of their occupied territories. While the Ukrainian human sacrifice of this war is growing, it makes Ukrainians even more determined to defeat Russia and join the Euro-Atlantic community. Miroslava Gangadze, VOA News, Kyiv, Ukraine.
Poland has been the first stop for millions of Ukrainians fleeing the war, with more than 1.5 million still there. Some Ukrainians crossing into Poland may be surprised at who's lending a helping hand. Our Henry Ridgewell is on refugee watch in the border town of Przemysl, Poland.
Maria Kruchkova says volunteering helps relieve her feelings of guilt as a Russian national. When Russia launched its invasion of Ukraine a year ago, she left her home city of Syktyvkar and came to the Poland-Ukraine border to help the refugees.
I need to help someone, and that's why I was trying to find volunteering programs somewhere in Poland. The first time I came here, I was quite afraid to tell people that I'm Russian because I felt a lot of feelings at that time, and I felt guilty. Sometimes it scares people, sometimes they're really happy. But now I realized that people from Ukraine, they need to know that there are a lot of Russians who are against the war and who support them.
The charity Russians for Ukraine runs a refugee shelter in this building close to the Ukrainian border. Among those staying here is Anna Sulmia and her family, who fled to Poland from Dnipro, not far from the Ukrainian front lines.
I really appreciate their support in the first place, despite the fact that they're Russian. In every nation, every population, there are some who are not good.
77-year-old Mikola Ivanovich has also been forced to flee his home. At first, he could not believe that Russia would wage war on Ukraine, so he stayed put. But a year into the war, Ivanovich says he has learned the true nature of Russia's invasion.
This is the eradication of the race. They want to eradicate Ukraine. They are not fighting, they are just exterminating the people, to erase Ukraine.
The Russian volunteers say they will continue to help Ukrainian refugees as long as they are needed. But for Kruchkova, that may not be easy. Her Polish visa will soon expire.
Recently, I got a message, a letter saying that I can be a national threat to Poland, and that's why probably they're not going to give me a permission to stay, but I'm just waiting for it to be confirmed or not, and then we'll decide what to do, because right now I cannot go to Russia because probably I will be in jail.
Kruchkova says she will apply for political asylum if she is refused permission to stay. Her flight to safety is one of choice, not survival. But like the Ukrainian refugees, she and thousands of other Russians are also fleeing the regime of Russian President Vladimir Putin. Henry Ridgewell for VOA News, Przemysl, Poland.
A year after Russia invaded Ukraine, the aftershocks are still reverberating around the world, from commodity markets to local markets. High costs of staples, fuel, and fertilizer are worsening global hunger, which was already deteriorating from the COVID-19 pandemic. More than 140 million people relied on aid from the World Food Program in 2022, a new high. That tops the record WFP set in 2021.
When World Food Program sets records, it's not a good thing for the world. We have been setting record after record after record.
The war and COVID have created a compound crisis, with one factor spilling into another. Take food production, for example. Wheat, corn, and sunflower oil from Russia and Ukraine supplied a significant chunk of global markets before the war. That's the first factor. A lot of the world's staples come from just a few places.
Less than 10 countries make up like 80-90% of exports of these commodities. And less than 5% hold like 80-90% of the stocks, reserves of these commodities. So when anything happens to any one of them, we feel the pain around the world.
One thing that happened before the war was bad weather in a few of those exporting countries. Those kinds of weather extremes are becoming more common with climate change. Bad weather causes bad harvests, which lead to price increases. They were already near record highs when the war broke out on February 24th, 2022.
The surges in food prices we saw starting February last year came after a year before of already surging prices. So it was a surge on top of a previous surge.
Energy markets also had a surge on top of a surge. Prices were already rising as the world recovered from COVID and raised demand. The war shook up oil and gas markets because Russia is a major producer. That raises food prices in two ways. First, it takes energy to make and transport food. Second, natural gas is key to making nitrogen fertilizer. The process takes a lot of energy, and it also uses natural gas as a main ingredient. Fertilizer prices also went up because Russia and Belarus were top suppliers, and both are under sanctions.
The constraints to the mobility of fertilizers plus the increasing natural gas increased significantly the prices of fertilizers, which at the maximum went 4 times higher than in the previous year.
The high cost of fertilizer is dragging out the impacts of the war into the next growing season. It means crops cost more to grow, so farmers grow less. That spreads the war's effects from Ukraine all the way to Asia.
The major concern outside of the war is the issue on rice, which is a consequence, an indirect consequence of the increasing price of fertilizers because of the war.
Growing rice uses a lot of fertilizer. Rice prices are rising because farmers are growing less. And the impacts don't stop there.
But we've seen some more visible effects, even though that average fertilizer usage is low, is in Africa.
Many governments in sub-Saharan Africa subsidize farmers' fertilizer costs.
That buffer is being taken away because governments could no longer afford to keep up the subsidies.
So farmers will grow less in some chronically food insecure countries. High fertilizer costs are one part of a cascading crisis in these countries. Many also subsidize the cost of food and fuel, and those costs are crushing their budgets. These governments already took on a lot of debt to deal with COVID, so budgets are reaching the breaking point. More than half of the world's low-income countries are on the brink of default or have already done so. The value of their currencies has shriveled, which makes matters worse because anything they import costs more.
If you are a poor country, if you have high debt, if you happen to import your food, fuel, and fertilizer, you're still in big trouble.
And the effects radiate out to prices in local markets, making food harder to afford. The fallout from Russia's invasion of Ukraine is leaving people hungry far from the battlefield.
Just because of the war in Ukraine, we calculated an increase in 10.7 million people more chronically undernourished.
WFP says 349 million people in 79 countries are struggling to get enough food, and more than 900,000 are close to famine. Prices have backed off a bit from last year's record highs, but there's little comfort in that.
Yes, prices are coming down at the global level, but no, it doesn't mean that life has been sorted out and everything is great in the countries where we work. We are definitely not out of the woods.
U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken visited Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan this week to, in the words of the State Department, deepen bilateral cooperation. Both countries were among the 32 that abstained from a non-binding UN resolution calling for Russia to immediately withdraw from Ukraine. Another abstention, Pakistan. The import-dependent country is facing soaring domestic prices while maintaining trade with Moscow for cheap energy. VOA Islamabad Bureau Chief Sara Zaman explains the diplomatic tightrope Pakistan is trying to walk.
Russia's war in Ukraine derailed Ali Hasnan's plan to acquire an affordable foreign degree in medicine. Hasnan was among hundreds of Pakistani students who fled Ukraine when Russian tanks rolled in.
I am not in touch with anyone in Ukraine because of the conditions there. I applied for admission to med school in Pakistan too, but could not succeed due to the high grades required here.
Russia's war put Pakistan in a difficult position on the world stage. Images of then Pakistani Prime Minister Imran Khan meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin in Moscow on the day Russian forces entered Ukraine embarrassed Islamabad. As supply disruptions pushed up food and fuel prices around the world, Pakistan's import-dependent economy, already beleaguered by the COVID-19 pandemic, devastating floods, and mounting debt, faced increasing pressure. Despite calling for peace, Pakistan, like a few dozen other countries, continued to abstain from voting on US-led UN resolutions that condemned Russian aggression.
I think the broader dynamic was that Pakistan wanted to maintain good ties with all major powers. The question arose essentially in the context of US-China competition, but I think the point was well made that we want to have good ties with US, with China, but also with Russia and all other powers.
Driven by growing food insecurity, Pakistan increased wheat imports from Russia. As its neighbor and arch-rival India ramped up cheap energy imports from Moscow to a record high, Pakistan pushed for discounted Russian oil and gas as well. The two sides may reach a formal deal late in March. Ukraine's ambassador to Pakistan, Markian Chuchuk, says Islamabad's policy of staying neutral in the conflict while doing business with Russia is ultimately helping Moscow.
A responsible country should not turn a blind eye to the fact that in doing business with Russia, it may support waging war through oil money.
Ukraine, a major supplier of wheat to Pakistan, saw bilateral trade drop 73% as its exports came under Russian attacks.
If Pakistan condemns Russian aggression against Ukraine, it doesn't mean that it becomes a puppet of the West. That may be a position of a sovereign state.
Chaudhry says Pakistan is exercising autonomy but not taking sides. With Ali Furqan and Getiara Anis, Sara Zaman, VOA News, Islamabad.
Casualties of war that are difficult to calculate are culture and the arts. Dozens of Ukrainian ballet dancers fled over the past year of war, finding their way to the Netherlands to form a ballet company in exile. Maria Ulyanovska caught up with them during a performance here in Washington.
These 6 dancers from Ukraine were forced to leave their homeland after Russia invaded. Today they make their home in the Netherlands, where they formed the United Ukrainian Ballet Company, and then embarked on a world tour that included a stop in Washington.
I had to grow up very fast. Back in Kiev, I lived with my parents, and when I had to leave Ukraine, I got to visit over 20 countries in a year. It was such a sudden change, but I'm getting used to it.
For a month, we lived a very tough life, and I realized I couldn't go on like that. I decided to leave. There was no work. The theater wasn't working then.
Before the war, Dmytro Borodai also danced with the National Opera of Ukraine. After Russia invaded, he traveled west from Kiev on foot.
We decided to just walk towards Khmelnytsky, so that's what we did. A couple of times we got picked by cars passing by, but in general, it was pure survival.
The idea to unite Ukrainian ballet dancers from across the country into one company came from Dutch ballerina Igona de Jong.
At the time I was dancing with 2 Ukrainian stars from the Kiev National Opera, and when the war started they were in Holland with me, and then through them I heard all these stories of their colleagues and friends in these horrible situations, and then I thought I want to try and help as many people as I can.
Many of the dancers never imagined they would end up in The Hague, let alone continue to perform and go on world tours.
I was going to go to France for a tour. I didn't take anything with me, just some winter clothes.
Despite never having worked together, dancers say they come together with something in common.
They all, and myself and my wife, our families are in Ukraine, so it's constant worry. Every morning starts with checking the news, just to make sure that your loved ones are okay. It's hard.
And no words speak louder than the beauty and sincerity of the ballet that these different artists with one shared story made happen. For Maria Ulyanovska, NRI's VOA News.
That's all for now. Stay up to date with all the news at voanews.com. Follow us on Instagram and Facebook at VOA News. And follow me on Twitter at CarolynVOA. Catch up on past episodes at our free streaming service, VOA Plus. For all those behind the scenes who brought you today's show, I'm Carolyn Pursuti. We'll see you next week for another The Inside Story.